Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Desi Thumkaa Podcast. My name is Ahmed, and today on the podcast, we have a very special guest with us, my best friend, Sarah Ladhani. So, Sarah, first off, I just want you to introduce yourself to all of our viewers and our listeners.
Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Ladani. I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia. Moved to LA for school, which is where I met Ahmed. And I was originally an architect, turned to structural engineer. And I feel like this is relevant, but my family is from Pakistan, and I think we'll get into that a little bit more later.
Yes, most definitely. So, the reason that I have Sarah as my second guest on the podcast is because if you listen to the first episode with my best friend Hashim, Hashim was born and raised in Pakistan and still lives there to this day. But Sarah's story is a bit different in the fact that her family is from Pakistan, but Sarah has never been to Pakistan or that side of the world per se, and she was born and raised in America, and that's where our conversation will kind of revolve around. So to kind of give our listeners a backstory of how Sarah and I first met and how we came to be friends. So as Sarah mentioned, Sarah went to USC for her undergraduate degree, which is where I went as well, and we were both studying architecture. Sarah and I were part of the same architecture professional fraternity called Alpha Rho Chi. And when I was at USC, Sarah was the only other brown person who I saw around me or knew of from a more senior level. Like when I was a freshman, Sarah was a sophomore. And I was instantly drawn to Sarah because, like, in a sea of like white people and other ethnicities, Sarah was the only other brown person who I saw. So when it came to our fraternity and choosing our big, which basically is a person who we want our to be our mentor in the fraternity. I chose Sarah because from the get-go, like without even knowing much about her, just the fact that like she was brown, I felt an instant connection with her. So Sarah, the first question I want to ask you is, when you think of the word desi, what comes to your mind?
I've actually been trying to define this for myself. I think for me, I think of it as the culture and the people from the like Indian subcontinent. So Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, maybe others that I'm forgetting, but the cultures, even some of the religions that are represented there, and the people from that region.
Hmm. And then a follow-up question, Sarah, do you identify with the word desi?
I feel like I have been more so in my later adult life. So, for background, I'm 28 right now. And I think until I was about like 18 to 20 years, I was like, yeah, I guess I'm Desi, but like I didn't really have that emotional connection with it. And it wasn't until I left and I moved to USC and that was completely away from my family that I started to kind of grapple with what it meant, what my culture, what my identity meant for me. And I think since then it's been growing a little bit more because now I'm a lot more curious about, where my family's from. Like, why do we eat the things that we do? Why do they have certain perceptions that I don't see reflected in my other families, my other friends' families? So I think it's a relationship that it's been developing for a while and one that I don't think has been steady my entire life.
And that's very interesting. And I guess this could be like a good segue to talk more about your childhood and you growing up as like a brown person in the South, especially like in the state of Georgia. How was that growing up for you? And were you more wary of like your skin color, your family skin color, like where your family came from? And how did you grapple with being brown, but at the same time being born and raised in America?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, Georgia, for background, is within the Bible Belt. So, there's a really strong prevalence of Christianity there, right? So, like Sunday mornings, there's pretty much no one on the streets because everyone's at church. There's usually no events or school events happening Sunday morning. It's a very like protected time, and that's just due to the fact that there are just a big representation of Christians within that area. I obviously did not fall into that demographic, so it was really interesting, kind of having to adapt my life to another religion's practices. Um, but like at the same time, I'm from Gwinnett County, which is a suburb outside of Atlanta, which is relatively diverse for the South. So in my county, there was a large, very large immigrant population. So we had a really big Pakistani, Indian, Korean, Chinese, somewhat Japanese population as well. So even though like maybe the umbrella had a lot of like dominantly white people, but like my personal experience was a lot more diverse. Even within my school, I had a lot of brown friends, I had a lot of Asian friends, I had a lot of friends from other ethnicities. Um, so it's not as, I guess, like homogenous as you would think, considering it is the South. And then also, like, my family came here, but they also had a lot of relationships um, from their friends who had also moved from Karachi to LA
Hmm.
to Atlanta. So there, it wasn't like we were starting completely fresh. There was a community that already existed there. Um,
Yeah, no, that's super interesting to hear. So, when you were younger, like say in school, surrounded by brown people or people of other ethnicities, was your desiness ever in your conscience then, or was that something that was like talked about in your family, like where you were from, or your family telling you stories about their time in Pakistan that might have piqued your interest into learning more about your culture as a child?
when I was younger, I think we did have those discussions more often. Like, where did my family live when they were in Karachi? Why did they move to? They moved from Karachi to Los Angeles to Atlanta, and then I was born in Atlanta. So they talked a little bit about that. But just to be completely frank, I wasn't extremely interested in those conversations. I didn't really relate to it. And it wasn't until I was older and I left my family and I moved to school when I kind of had to start almost from scratch and like start building my own community and start
Hmm.
finding like my own friends and connections, then I was able to relate to their story a little bit more. And obviously, it's not nearly the same extreme as going from one continent to another and one culture to
Hmm.
another. Whereas I was just moving across the US. So I know it wasn't nearly to that extent, but it was a smaller reflection of what they had to go through. And that's when I became a bit more interested in what their story was and like how they were able to grapple with that and build their own relationships and community and start going to school and like start finding jobs.
Hmm.
And the other thing too is like they within our home, we had a lot of Indian food, Pakistani food, things like that. And for me, I just kind of assumed it was a given. This is just what home food is like. Wasn't really
Hmm.
interested in it. Didn't really want to engage in it. And then I moved to LA, and like that food was not accessible to me at all. And I was like, oh, this is great. I never gravitated towards it, anyways. But then after like 6 months to a year, I was like, I just really want some dal. Like, I just want some really
Hmm.
basic Indian home food that's like not like some fusion restaurant that's like LA. I just want like real good food. And that was so hard to find because I took it for granted. And then
Hmm.
since then, whenever I went home, I was like, oh my gosh, please just like, I just want dal chawal. Like, I want really basic chai or anything. That reminded me of home. And then I could also appreciate like that the quality of the food that I had at home was extremely good. It was really good. It was
Hmm.
really delicious. And I never kind of gave it any credit before until I had left and was basically stripped of that access.
Right. Yeah. And that's actually a great follow-up question for this. Um, so how you were talking about that you didn't really appreciate some aspects of like your Desi culture until you were removed from the situation and came to LA. How was that journey for you? Of like you had mentioned before as well in the beginning of the podcast that you started to become more aware of your culture when you came to LA and you didn't have, say, that safety net of like your family, and you came more into consciousness of like, oh, this is a bigger part of who I am than you had thought previously. So can you just dwell a little bit more into that?
Yeah, I think it kind of helped too because USC has a really big international student population and maybe even more so within architecture. So there were really a huge representation of people from so many different countries and like just through conversation with them got to learn a lot about their cultures, which made me think a little bit more about my own. And it would kind of show up in small ways too, right? Like up until I was maybe like 25, I always introduced myself as Sarah. I like never even thought about it. Like that's how I have always introduced myself. And then I started to think, and I'm like, but that's not what my family calls me. Like my family calls me Sarah, and like I I don't know why they never questioned that I would introduce myself as Sarah. The other little things that would come up too is like I understand Urdu. I'm not great at speaking it, but I understand it. Also, like I'm Muslim, so I can speak some Arabic as well. And like there was no reason for me to pronounce certain things in a very like Americanized way. Like I can say
Mm-hmm.
Afghanistan, I don't have to say Afghanistan, I don't have to say
Mm-hmm.
Iran, I can say Iran, I can say Iraq. Like I can say words properly, and I would start making those like tiny little tweaks in my everyday
Mm-hmm.
language because like there was no reason for me to be more American than I needed to be because I did have
Mm-hmm.
this other part of my culture. And I was also fortunate too because my roommates were all Indian or Pakistani. Actually, I think they were all Indian from background. They all grew up here in the U.S. as well. So it was like even though I was removed from my family, I was still kind of immersed in some way with other people that looked like
Mm-hmm.
me. And then it kind of made like our own backgrounds a little bit more accessible and easier to talk
Mm-hmm.
about.
No, I think this concept of having a community is so important, and it's also very interesting. Like when you were in college, like of course I knew all of your roommates, and they were all kind of in a similar situation as you, where like their families had come from like the Indian subcontinent, like India, Pakistan, but like they had been born and raised here. But all of you were able to like connect on this fact that you were still connected to your ethnicities, to your culture, and that was like a common ground for all of you. Even though like all of you mostly, I assume, communicated in English, there was still this sense of community that like you guys were there for each other just based off the fact that you could have had this connection of desiness among all of you. So I kind of going into this a little bit more at USC when we were in the School of Architecture, how was it for you that we didn't really talk much about our culture or our architects? Our education and our curriculum was very much focused on like more white and Western architects, and that's kind of what they were teaching us. Is that something that you felt in your education as well? And had you hoped that they had talked more, not specifically even about Desi architects, but about architects from other cultures and backgrounds?
Yes. Well, it wasn't even something that I questioned while I was going through the schooling process. And maybe it was just because that was a reflection of like the history that I was taught in like high school, middle school, things like that. It was also very Eurocentric, even during like world history classes. Like it was still more focused on Europe versus Asia.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I never really even, I didn't even like register with me that I was only learning about architects with a very specific look, mostly white, older male architects that we were learning about. And then it wasn't until like later that I started to question that, like, I actually really don't know a whole lot about this. And during our like religious education classes growing up, we did learn about like the Mughal Empire, the Byzantines, Ottomans,
Mm-hmm.
things like that. But it was very much like that was what I learned in religious classes. And then European stuff is what I learned during school. And now looking back, I do realize that I wish we had approached more, I guess, like Asian, even South American architecture with the same rigor that we did to European and Americans. And
Mm-hmm.
because it's like something you can do now, or it's something that I can do now, but it's not. I do wish that it had like kind of the support system and the resources that those other more like common architects are given when we're taught because it does result in a very like one-sided view of this like
Mm-hmm.
very very diverse field that we're in.
Mm-hmm. No, for sure. And I feel very similar to that. I feel like not being like quote unquote white and American is like even after our education, we kind of have to educate ourselves once again about like our culture and our history and like architects and engineers that we can relate to, knowing that, like this field has existed since the beginning of time. So obviously there would be like architects who've done like incredible work in like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka that we should be knowing about. And now this is something that we have to take upon ourselves. And saying of all of that, Sarah, now in your professional world, you have transitioned from being an architect into an engineer, which once again has the stigma of being a predominantly like male centric, more white field. So you being like a Desi female identifying person, how has that been working as an engineer?
I think so. At the moment, it's just very technical focused. So there isn't a whole lot of input that I can put on the design side. I think where I'm at right now is interesting because it's it's a lot more diverse relative to other like engineering firms that I can think of off the top of my head, in the sense that there are people from like non-American country, or like not America basically,
Mm-hmm.
or other North American countries, but the majority of like other countries that are representative or represented is European. So it still kind of
Mm-hmm.
has that lean towards what's, typical of like white architecture. I think there is more that can be done in terms of diversifying the field. Although I do see sometimes progress is slow, right? Like you would,
Mm-hmm.
in an ideal world, like I really want to see the people who are principals reflecting the like, I guess, demographic that I am, female, brown would be great, but like that's not where we're at. So I do see an effort at the moment to really empower like younger staff and like start hiring folks who are a bit more diverse. And I'm seeing that like in practice, and I saw it through, grad school as well. And it takes a while for the folks like me to start rising up through the ranks. But I do appreciate that that is at least acknowledged, and
Mm-hmm.
some resources are putting there. But, it's also a bit frustrating to kind of like, the higher you go up in this structure, the like wider and more male leaning it becomes, and
Mm-hmm.
that's hard to grapple with, like, because you can't really just put anybody in that position if they fit, the check boxes that you have. They
Mm-hmm.
also need to have the experience, and like we just don't really have enough of those people available. So it's someone you just
Mm-hmm.
have to start building up.
Yeah. And this might be a loaded question, but like say like in a few years when you do get to that position where like the newer generation of engineers and architects coming in can look up to you as like a brown female who has a more higher senior position. What do you think in that instance you, when you are in that more senior position, can do to like highlight more Desi culture, or just this non-white figure who can be like a bigger representation for everyone else?
Yeah, I think people empathize the most with people who have similar life experiences to them. And so
Hmm.
generally so like if you are in hiring positions, um, at least the people I've interviewed with, they tend to be white, male, and from, a modest to like well socioeconomic backgrounds. Whereas,
Hmm.
like, for me, the people that I empathize the most with are people like me, so female, minority, people who maybe came from like less, I guess, wealthy backgrounds.
Hmm.
And so I feel like as you help empower those people, then you can start, you're able to identify potential in the same way that other people were able to identify potential in me. And then the bit about like the Desi culture, a lot of it really unfortunately has to be through self learning. Because even if I were to go
Hmm.
out at the time and like seek out, um, like specific classes that would teach me about Desi architecture or like non-Western architecture, it would be really difficult. Like the only
Hmm.
class I can think of are more related towards Japanese architecture, which is fascinating, but also like one very specific type. Um, so yeah, I think it's a lot of it is like self learning in order to kind of incorporate that into my practice, and then also like when I talk to other people and teach them, then I can kind of
Hmm.
bring in some of those principles. But also on the other side, when you are designing, I think there is a lot of limitations on how much influence you have. So from what I've noticed as a structural engineer, a lot of it tends to be analysis, and it's just purely based on the codes. And so there
Hmm.
isn't, so it's like, even if you want to design something that is, I don't know, more sustainable and uses more like practices that are related to specific climates, it
Hmm.
still has to meet these certain code requirements that are kind of void of any context. And then
Right.
having that like void of context makes your buildings kind of lean towards being a little bit more homogenous. And even
Mm-hmm.
that part, like I'm still kind of grappling with as well. Like I'm not really sure how to address that in a way that's like economically feasible, right? Because you don't have an
Mm-hmm.
unlimited amount of time and resources that you can put into a project. It kind of has to be done like on budget and on time. And then the quickest
Mm-hmm.
way to do that is just to kind of make sure that you're hitting all the code requirements and then like on to the next one. And I'm not saying that's the way it should be, but I am
Mm-hmm.
saying like that's kind of been my experience so far. And like I'm still kind of trying to work through my own head, like can we do better in a way that's more efficient and
Right.
not time intensive.
No, that all sounds incredible, and I really do hope that, like you said, in these architecture, engineering, more white male-dominated sectors, we do get to see more minorities, more people of color, people of all from all spectrum of sexuality, gender. I think is so important that, like, as we strive to make this world, a more accepting and open place for everyone, it's important to see more people like that in STEM as well. So transitioning from your work life more into your private life, I know a huge part of who you are, Sarah, is your community and your religion. And I want to talk more about how that has formed your upbringing into who you are today, and how that can tie into learning more about your desiness and your culture and where you come from.
Yeah. So for a little bit of background, I'm Ismaili, which is a sect under the under Shia Muslims. It's a relatively small sect, kind of considering like the larger Shia and Sunni populations. But from what I've gathered, it's extremely active and tight knit with a huge emphasis on community. And I, I don't even know if I'll be able to do it justice, but a lot of
Mm-hmm.
there there are like there is like relatively strong larger populations and then in the US. So Atlanta has a really big community, LA somewhat, Texas for sure, and then other major cities around here. And within the community, there is a big emphasis on bringing people together, like in the religious context, but also in almost all aspects of life. So, there's like a health board to help uh, various populations within the Smiley group, navigate the health process. Or, unfortunately, if someone passes away, we do have we have an organization that helps with planning funeral services. So there are all these different things that we have to help the social side and provide these different social services and almost like a social safety net within our
Mm-hmm.
community. Um, which is incredible. And I was brought up through that. I was very active through it. My family was as well. Um, and from my experience, there has been this like very strong emphasis on the youth, and
Mm-hmm.
bringing them up, having camps that are dedicated towards helping them build community, building safe spaces where they can talk about their experiences or find other people, even in a professional setting. Like, oh, you're an architect. Like, hi, I'm like in high school and I, really interested in kind of following this path. I'd love to chat with you. So connecting people in different ways, and it's made me feel very connected and also like supported. And what I love about it is that it's kind of devoid of, or it's kind of strong regardless of where you are. So I grew up in Atlanta, moved to LA, and I was able to very easily integrate into that community here as well. One of my roommates was also Ismaili, so it was really great and easy to meet other people. Even if you never knew them before, you still share some sort of background, which is also,
Mm-hmm.
I think, why, brown people kind of come to gravitate towards each other naturally, why you gravitated towards me really naturally, is because even though we're not in that particular community, we still share some similar life experiences simply
Mm-hmm.
from the color of our skin.
For
Um,
sure. Mm-hmm.
yeah. And then, kind of going on with that too, like I moved to Boston for a year, easily able to integrate into the community there. London for a little bit, same thing too. And that has just been, it's just provided, it's kind of like a comfort blanket, whereas I always know that I have someone to rely upon. And it's just been like, I think, really great knowing that that exists, but it has also shaped a lot of my values. So I like very strongly value community, strongly value mentorship and helping other people out. And that was shaped because I was fortunate to be brought up in a community that has shown that level of like kindness towards me.
Hmm. And Sarah, so most of the people who identify as Ismaili, I believe, come from Pakistani, Indian, more Desi backgrounds, correct?
Um, it's a little bit more diverse than that. So it does represent a maybe the largest population within the US does have Pakistani Indian backgrounds, but there's
Hmm.
also a pretty significant population in Central Asia, so like Afghanistan, Tajikistan, even Russia. So it is a little bit more diverse, but I do think Pakistani Indians represent a sizable chunk of that
Hmm.
population.
And Sarah, also the Aga Khan Architecture Award is
Mhm.
also, I guess, more stems from the Ismaili background, correct? Like if I'm not 100% sure, so please do correct me. But Aga Khan is part of the Ismaili community, right? And in that sense, architecture also is a bigger role, I want to say, in the Ismaili community, because I know that is something that you are more involved in as well.
Yeah, so two parts to that. So like the Aga Khan, he's the present living imam, and he has different initiatives. So AKDN, the Aga Khan Development Network, AKAA, the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. There are different like subsets of things that he kind of oversees, but it's not exclusive to Ismailis. In fact,
Hmm.
um, their charter is generally to help all. So AKDN, for example, is to charter to help all impoverished communities, regardless of their religious backgrounds. So they'll,
Hmm.
provide the same resources to like Hindu communities as they would to other Muslims. So like that's not really a factor in who they help out with. And then for the award for architecture, um, I don't want to misrepresent it, but that's also not exclusive to
Hmm.
Muslim architecture or Islamic architecture or Ismaili specific architecture. I think it is more geared towards architecture in Africa and Asia.
Hmm.
Yeah, definitely check me on this, but it's not exclusive towards Ismailis, and it's usually, I think there is some emphasis on local practices and helping like the local community, and
Hmm.
using like local resources and historic techniques. I think is also
No,
a
that's
factor.
amazing. No, thank you for telling us more about that because I didn't have much information about that to begin with either. So Sarah, diverting a bit from this, another question that I've always wondered and wanted to ask people who are in a position such as yourself, where just because of the skin color that they are born into, there's already like certain connotations that are certain, I guess, stereotypes that might be put on them, right? Like you are brown, that is something that you stick with you for the rest of your life. However, you were born in America and raised to be American, right? Like when you would introduce yourself to someone, you would tell them that you are American, but your skin color is brown. So I often hear stories about how people who are in a similar situation to you always struggle with grasping both sides of that straw, right? Where you are brown, your family is brown, you're expected to act a certain way. However, you were born in America and raised in America with, say, like both American and Pakistani values in your case. So, has that something that you have struggled with in your life, trying to connect those two pieces of your identity together? And have they also clashed at certain times?
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, right? When people meet you for the first time, they're like, "Hey, like, where are you from?" And that's always such a loaded question because they want to know like your country of origin. But for me,
Hmm.
that's the U.S. Like, I grew up in the U.S. I've never been to Asia. I've never been to Pakistan. Like, I have a hard time saying I'm Pakistani sometimes because like there's so much. I feel like that's a very loaded um, part of my identity that I don't think I've invested almost any time into in any real
Hmm.
meaningful way. Like it's hard for me to say I'm Pakistani, but like have never been there. I've never really experienced anything to do with the country directly. Like indirectly, I think
Hmm.
definitely for sure. So the way I was end up answering that question is like, oh, I'm from Atlanta. And then you wait for that awkward pause and you're like, but my
Uh,
family is from Pakistan. And they're like, oh, okay, so she's Pakistani. But like, I do
hmm.
emphasize that like my family is from there, and so like through them I think received that cultural knowledge, but it hasn't been that like one-to-one relationship. And I know, I think growing up brown in the US, this isn't like the greatest thing, but I think I benefit from it is that
Mm-hmm.
I think all Asians kind of get that model minority status where, like, you know, you're just this, you stereotyped into being, you know, well educated or really smart, dedicated, hardworking. And that's only prescribed to certain minorities and not others. And like, I
Mm-hmm.
guess I happen to get, you know, the larger end of the stick, which isn't necessarily like something that I personally achieved prior to someone meeting me. But one thing that other Asians in the country do kind of benefit from. Um, and then again, I think like because I grew up in Gwinnett County that is so diverse. I really don't think that I I don't know, I've never felt like too othered, and maybe it was just because I was younger and like that didn't really like penetrate my consciousness, that feeling that like there were other expectations on me. Because I could relate to so many people around me because there were so many other
Mm-hmm.
first generation Americans around me, that for me that was just normal. That wasn't abnormal at all.
Mm-hmm. No, that's very interesting to hear for sure. Um, so kind of, I guess, piggybacking off that a little bit. Now, as you mentioned previously in the podcast as well, you are more aware of your Desi culture in more recent years. Have there been incidents as such that have made you more aware of your Desiness and the fact that you feel like now in your life that is a part of your personality that you do want to learn more about? Like, just to kind of dwell into that a little bit, when I met you for the first time and for the longest time until very recently, I have referred to you as Sarah as well, right? And it wasn't until more recently that you started like correcting me and trying to like tell people that you already knew or were introducing for the first time to go as Sarah. So why in more recent years did you feel the need to like, that is just like one example, but I think it is a very big example, right? Because our name is something that is very important to us, right? Like for my name, for example, is very, very hard for most Americans or white people or foreigners to get right. And we see in some other cultures where they do take on more American names to make it easier for themselves. But you, on the other hand, are trying to make this conscious decision of making your name sound more Pakistani and more how you would like it to be pronounced. So, can you just tell a little bit more to us about that journey?
Yeah. Okay, so two bits. The first one is the name. So when I was sometime during my undergrad process, I attended this like service thing also through the Smiley community where I met two people named Sarah. Both were spelled differently and they introduced themselves as Sarah. And I don't know why that particular moment just like really resonated with me because there was no it's Sarah, not Sarah. It was just like, hey, my name is Sarah. And then maybe 20 minutes later, met someone else and she was also named Sarah. And then for me, it was like, it was so casual and so comfortable the way they introduce themselves. And then I thought about it myself and I'm like, my name is actually Sarah too. And it's not even like that I wanted to make it more Desi or more Pakistani or anything. It was truly like I kind of believe that, you know, I have a great relationship with my parents and my mom named me Sarah and my family calls me Sarah. So that is my name and there's no reason for me to
Mhm.
change it. Um, but I did introduce myself as Sarah all the time and I didn't consider it. And it wasn't until I met these two Sarahs back to back that I was like, wait, like my name is actually Sarah too. Like that's the name that was given to me and I don't have a reason to reject it. So why am I not saying Sarah? And it was also in the middle of my undergrad years. So like I had already met a lot of people. It would have been weird to make that shift. And then I graduated, COVID happened, and then I was going to grad school and I was like, okay, now I'm meeting a lot of people for the first time. And like if I'm going to actually be serious about introducing myself as Sarah, this is going to be a great time to do it because once I don't do it, it's going to be really hard to get people to switch back. So I was like,
Mhm.
let me just test it out. And so I was like, yeah, my name is Sarah. And if they'll say Sarah, I'm like, oh, it's actually pronounced Sarah. And like no questions asked, people just rolled with it. And I was like, why did I hesitate for so long? Because like people really accepted it. There wasn't any pushback. But I am like really flexible with people that I've known for so long, because I didn't make that switch till I was like, what, 25? Whereas I've had
Mm-hmm.
friends for up to 25 years who had always called me Sarah, and I don't expect them to change, but they're aware that like I do prefer Sarah. But
Mm-hmm.
it is hard to make that switch if you've like, known someone for so long, call them what they told you that they wanted to be called, and then they kind of do a 180. So lots,
Mm-hmm.
lots of grace there. But like, it's been really interesting too to like hear my coworker, my white coworkers, like correct other people. Like, no, her name isn't Sarah, it's Sarah. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
thanks. Like, thanks for advocating for me, because it can get a little bit awkward to make that correction.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the other bit that made me kind of lean into the Desi bit is LA is extremely diverse. Boston is pretty diverse. Atlanta isn't really. Like in my little bubble of Gwinnett County, I felt like it was super diverse. And then I took a job and I was working for about a year and a half full time, mostly during COVID. And it was in Atlanta. And so whenever I end up working in Atlanta, like for some reason, all that diversity goes away, and it's
Mm-hmm.
very, very white and male for the most part, like by far.
Mm-hmm.
And it probably was like most of the people I worked with were from like Alabama and Georgia. And then I used to go on these different site visits. So I would have to travel every couple of weeks. And then I would stay with these group of people and do different assessments on site. I was working in architecture at the time. And like a lot of these people, I realized, especially the ones who weren't from Atlanta, who maybe were from more, um, I guess, isolated communities or less diverse
Mm-hmm.
communities than the South, they would ask me that question, like, oh, where are you from? And like, they wouldn't really be satisfied with the Atlanta answer. So then I would have to go into the whole, my parents are from Pakistan. And then they would like ask me these little questions that felt a little bit out of pocket, like specific things about the food or like specific things about the country, even though I like mentioned that I've never actually been, so I'm not an expert. I can't really talk on it. But if I looked at everyone else around me, I was the only female usually. I was the only brown person. I was the only Muslim person. So whether or not
Mm-hmm.
I liked it, I was a representative for all females,
Mm-hmm.
all Muslims, all Pakistanis in that room. And then it made me realize like if I have to be the representative, I kind of want to know more about what I'm representing, because I don't want to misrepresent an entire community. And so that was another catalyst for me to like start thinking a little bit more critically about like who I am and like what does my identity like really mean and what does represent. Because if I'm the only person in the room, then like the way I represent myself is the way they're going to see all people who fit kind of my umbrella term.
Mm. No, I think you said that so incredibly well because I feel like as POCs, no matter what ethnicity, culture, minority you might be from, when you're in a room of say like mostly like white people or even people of other cultures, you do get this pressure put on you that you are the representative for all your people, for your entire culture, for all brown people, and like the way that you act, like especially like you were saying, these people who are like from more isolated communities, they will hold on to that for the rest of their life. And like if you put
Yeah.
a good impression for them, they will for the rest of their life know that, oh, I met this one brown girl and like she was incredible, so all brown people must be incredible. But like if you do anything out of like pocket or anything wrong, they'll hold that with them for the rest of their life. So it is this added pressure that is put on us that we need to be conscious at all times that like we're like not doing anything that can put us in a bad light, because we're not only representing ourselves but our entire community, our entire country. Like you said, that you are representing a country that you have never even been to, but at the same time it is also quite commendable on your end that you have taken this mantle upon yourself to like learn more about your culture and your community and your people, that if you are ever put in that position, you know what to say and to put our culture, our community, our people in like a more positive and like better light. So Sarah, kind of having talked about all of that, another question that I want to ask you is, has there ever been a moment in your life where either your desiness was questioned or you had to hide your desiness in order to like fit in anywhere?
That's a good question. I think it's almost impossible to hide my daciness. Simply by looking at me, like I maybe I
Mm-hmm.
can be like culturally ambiguous, but like for sure I'm a minority. Maybe some people can't tell where I'm from, but like for sure a minority, and so that part of it I think is relatively. Uh, I can't really hide from it. Sometimes I do question though, like if, if I were to just give my resume to someone, my first name spelled the way it is, Sarah,
Hmm.
is a Western name. And like maybe unknowingly I have benefited from having that very clear Western or like I guess less ambiguous name because maybe for my last name you can't really tell who I am or where I'm from, but from that first name, like I could be white. You don't really know. And so I've actually
Hmm.
wondered, like, have there been situations where like maybe I've been like profiled to my benefit in ways that maybe
Hmm.
like if they had known, maybe if I was like I don't know, had another more Muslim sounding name, then like maybe I would have been passed over for something. Um, yeah, so in that regard, I don't know. And then there isn't really one specific moment that I can think of where I've had to hide it on purpose.
Hmm.
And maybe too, because like, if you don't look at me, but you just hear my voice, like I grew up in the
Hmm.
US, I have an American accent. Like it's not super obvious if you don't look at
Hmm.
me that I don't really fit the profile of an American. And in some ways, I kind of feel like I do because my experience is like, I went to a high school, like I, went to football games, like I've been to middle schools where there were cheerleaders. Like I do have, in some ways, a typical Southern, uh, like childhood experience, even if I don't fit the part of somebody who would stereotypically have that experience. And I can speak to
Hmm.
that because I did grow up in that manner.
Hmm. And I guess this question might be a bit similar, but have there ever been any experiences in your life where you feel like you have been discriminated based on your appearance or based on your skin color? Because I was going to bring this up as well. The fact that you said that, like, if you just read your first name and, like, say if I were on a telephone conversation with you, I would just think that you are, like, white American just because, like, in my mind, you have an American accent, you have a white ambiguous name like you said that it could be fit into many different cultures, but the conversation changes when, like, people see you face to face. Then suddenly the first thing that they notice about you is that, like, oh, you are brown. And then people, the clock, everything starts turning, and then certain stereotypes that people might have about brown culture or brown people are immediately put upon you. So, you have had the opportunity to travel abroad, like all over the world and stuff. So even, like, say it doesn't even have to be just in America, but even abroad, have you felt that, like, you were discriminated against just because of your race?
Yeah. Sometimes in retrospect, I wonder if there were more times that I was discriminated against just being like growing up in the South. And I wonder if I just didn't recognize it at the time because I was younger and like I just wasn't
Hmm.
more aware. So like I'm even now I just kind of want to go to ask my family like did you ever feel this way because you were older, like you were an adult and you lived in the South, like maybe their experience is different than mine. But for me, like in my childhood, not really. Although I do remember having a lot of conversations because I was like 5, 6 years old when 9/11 happened. And like that was in the
Hmm.
US and that was obviously huge. But I was so young that like I don't think I understood the gravity of the situation. And then like I said, there are a lot of activities geared towards the smiley youth. So I would be in a
Hmm.
lot of conversations where we were kind of people would be sharing their experiences. And I know like from my guy friends, a lot of them did notice that like they were stopped more at the airport or like maybe they were bullied a little bit more. And like that didn't happen to me, but they happened to people that were close to me. Um,
Hmm.
and then I think I've told you this before too, but like for the first time I went to visit Nashville and that for me was the first like very like overtly clear like racial experience that I had, and it happened twice. Like I was with a group of brown people. I don't remember how many, maybe like at least five, maybe more. There was one white person in the group, but he wasn't like
Hmm.
always there. And so we were, out on Broadway as one does in Nashville, and someone just kind of came up to us. At that time, it was only brown people in that. There was a little circle of us, and someone kind of came up to us, flashed the white power sign, just stood there looking, and I just like I froze. I didn't know what to do, and then he walked away. And I think I was just really upset because I didn't even know how to react in that moment, or what
Hmm.
I could have done to prevent it, to address it. I guess I wasn't really sure. And then, kind of to add to that, the next morning we found that somebody had egged my friend's car and we were all staying at this Airbnb, and it was just brown people. And I don't know if that was necessarily because we were brown, but like the neighborhood we were staying in was like very, very white. And
Mm-hmm.
so it was, especially like right after the white power thing, it was really hard for my mind not to go there. Like, why else would you want
Right.
our car? We weren't misparked. We weren't in anybody's property except the property that we had paid for and we're staying at. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I really didn't know what to make of it, although it did make me pretty upset because it's like we didn't do anything. We did nothing except
Mm-hmm.
exist and contribute to the local economy. Like that's it. That's all we
Mm-hmm.
did.
Mm-hmm.
And then traveling abroad, I what was interesting is I felt extremely welcome and for some reason like very comfortable in Kenya, and I think that's because there is so many Indian influences there. Like even with the food was very comfortable. I could relate a lot to that. Maybe we had different terms for it, but like it was very curry based. They had chai every single day, and that was like really lovely to see. And also there is a relatively large South Asian population there, so like it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
uncommon to see people of my skin color. Um, in some regions, I think the village I was at specifically, they called me white, like not in a derogatory term, but like they did call me white in Swahili, and like they would like touch my skin, and not in any, it just purely out of curiosity, like very
Mm-hmm.
innocent curiosity. Like there was nothing like negative behind that. So that was
Mm-hmm.
like very interesting to be considered like white all of a sudden. And then the other bit, I don't know if this had to do with race or like maybe it was more because I sounded like a dumb American tourist, but like I also had like a very poor reception. I was traveling with two other people who were like me, first generation Americans, in the south of France and also even in Paris too. And we were just like not treated very well. And I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
that had to do with us being brown. It was a group of three of us, or if it had to do with just like another American tourist who like doesn't know how to speak French. So I'm not really sure
Mm-hmm.
where that fell, and maybe that kind of speaks to your point too. It's like whenever I'm not treated with a lot of respect, I don't know where it comes from. Like I don't know if it's
Mm-hmm.
because I sound American. I don't know if it's because I look brown. I don't know like where that is, or if they're just having a bad day. I don't know, but that is like part of the equation always too. It's like, is my brown laciness contributing in any way to the way you perceive me? And I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
There's not always a straightforward answer for that.
Mm-hmm. No, that's very interesting. And I do remember this conversation we had about you traveling to France because I was actually traveling to France a couple of weeks later, and you had warned me beforehand that, like the people weren't most receptive, like just be wary, like and there's also this stereotype that like French people are perhaps a bit more racist. And the very interesting thing is that when I went to France, I was actually traveling with a friend of mine who happened to be white. And when I came back, I told Sarah that my experience was completely different than hers, right? Like nobody had been like rude to me. Like even though like we had gone to the exact same spaces, perhaps maybe like 2 weeks apart, our experiences were so different. And it does bring into this question like, was it because I was traveling with somebody who was white, but you were a group of, three brown women? I guess we'll never know the answer to that, but it is an interesting thing to wonder about. So, Sarah, having said all this, as we are approaching towards the end of our podcast, my first question is, do you feel that as you mature and grow up, your desiness is a part that you want to acknowledge more, learn about more, and make it a bigger part of who you are as a person? Or do you feel that where you are in your life right now, that's like not something that you care about too much or doesn't play a huge role in your life as of right now?
Yeah, I think I'm a lot more curious about it, and in some ways a lot more comfortable with it. Like I was never a huge like Bollywood music listener, but I would listen to it sometimes, and now I'm like I don't mind throwing it on in the car if I have like non-Desi people with me because they'll listen to it and it's fine and I can talk about it and it's like a great conversation starter. Or like again, like before I never used to like Indian food, then I moved away and I was like, wait, actually this food is really good, and like why am I hiding from it? Like I tell pretty much every single person I know how much I love mango lassi. Like I'm
Mm,
so much more like open to talking about it. Like I also like do am interested in like sharing like the food and some of the cultural bits a little bit more. And like, because now that I have found myself to sometimes be a speaker for being Muslim and Pakistani, then I do feel like the onus is kind of on me to like make sure I understand it and learn about it a little bit more. I don't want to feel like pressure to like learn everything,
Mm-hmm.
but I am a lot more receptive and open to it. And a lot of that has to do with like meeting you too, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
before you, I didn't really have anyone my age that was from Pakistan or India that I was really close to. And like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm very curious about your background because, like, you know, in a parallel life, that could have been my background. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
am very interested. Like, your background probably reflects the way my parents grew up too. And like, now I am
Mm-hmm.
really interested in learning more about that. And then, like I said too, like in some spaces, like whether or not I like it or whether or not I choose for it to be, I represent Pakistan sometimes. You know, like you guys might not see me as the Pakistani that should represent it. I don't probably see myself as the person who should represent it, but sometimes I am the default. And like because of
Mm-hmm.
that, I do think the onus is on me to like do my part in being able to represent it well and as accurately as I can to the best of my ability.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and just in general too, like now that I am aware, part of it's awareness too, right? Like now that I am aware that my education and background has been so Eurocentric, I almost want to like switch the like pendulum back and like learn more about the other side of it so I can, I guess, like increase my world knowledge, but also like
Mm-hmm.
relate to the people from whom I come, you know, whether or not I
Right.
feel very close to them. But like that is my history, you know, my parents' history.
Mm-hmm. No, for sure. And you know, just as your friend over these past 8, 9 years, like it's been such an interesting journey for me to see how much you have come into your Desiness and your culture and how you've become so much more comfortable with it. Just like over these past few years, just seeing how like you are more comfortable speaking Urdu and you understand it more and you're able to communicate with me in Urdu more. And like even though you might not think that your Urdu is that great, you know, like to me as somebody who's a fluent Urdu speaker, like I'm fully able to communicate with you in just Urdu sometimes, you know, and the fact that like we go out and see like Bollywood movies and we're able to talk about them and just like relate to that so much more is just like such an interesting journey for me. And I'm just excited to see where that goes for you. And then hopefully one day you'll come to Pakistan and
I
visit
know,
your
hopefully.
roots and your background. Like that is something that I'm really trying to get Sarah to come to Pakistan with me. Like, you know, next time I go back home, hopefully Sarah will be able to just come, you know, and learn more about where she comes from and be able to, you know, put herself in her parents and her family's shoes and just see like where they grew up. I think that would be an incredible experience for you. And as we're ending our podcast, Sarah, I want you to, you know, if you have any side businesses, wing wing, that you know you want to talk about, you know, the floor is all yours.
Okay, before I get into that, I do want to just thank you so much for letting me be on this podcast and also like for letting me be part of your journey because I think
Mm.
your curiosity and wanting to share this like Desi culture with the rest of the world has me learning so much more and like wanting me to um, question some things, but also like just take in as much as I can. So thank you so much.
Oh no,
As for
thank
my
you. That means a
plug,
lot. Yes.
um, I do have a little side business on Etsy. I have a storefront called Do It Like Sarah, not Sarah. And I just basically make a lot of maps, and it's an outlet for me to have fun with, you know, geography and traveling and creating posters for people. So feel free to look that up. It's Do It Like Sarah, all one
Yeah, no,
word.
I'll be sure to like put your Etsy in the link. And guys, please do check it out. I have ordered multiple gifts from Sarah. If you don't know what to get someone as a birthday present or as a gift, like please just go onto Sarah's Etsy website. Like she's done incredible maps and like every single person I give them to always love it so, so much. And I'll be
Yay.
sure to put Sarah's like personal Instagram if she's feels comfortable with me sharing that so you people can follow her, follow Sarah's journey as an architect turned engineer now. If you guys want to reach out to Sarah about any engineering questions that you might have, please feel free to do so. And thank you
Totally.
again so, so much, Sarah, for being our guest on the Desi Thumkaa podcast and just letting the world a little bit of insight into your beautiful mind, into your beautiful world, and just, you know, sprinkling in that laughter, that love, that joy that we all love so much about you. So thank you once
Thank
again.
you so much.